I am so happy to see you all this morning. I was my name's Greg Sarris, as you probably know, and in addition to all the other things I do, I am the chairman of my tribe, and last night we were meeting, as my co-chairperson here, Lynn Silva, will tell you, till midnight, and we were just rushing down here, but I'm so excited to be here. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is the panel is, of course, it's titled, what did she give it? Timeless Wisdom. So I'm going to take us way back in time and take us forward a little bit in time and then go way back again with the stories that I wrote for today. Because I think it's really important that we know a little bit about where we are and where we're sitting. So if you'll allow me, let me give the stories in the book I wrote a historical context, a history of California in about 7 or 8 minutes. It's about, 10,000 years in 7 or 8 minutes. First of all, where we're sitting right now and where you're sitting, there were more indigenous people here, particularly in the North Bay, Santa Rosa, Marin, Lake County, and this area, than there was anywhere else in the New World outside of the present site of Mexico City, which was the Aztec capital, of course. And people really didn't know much or hear much about the California Indians. The media, as you know, talks a lot. I'm hearing a lot of noise over here. The media always portrayed the Plains Indian. And the thing is that we've always looked at cultures and different people through our own lens. And people, including the Franciscan Padres, always thought the California Indians were the dumbest. They didn't have anything that we recognized, the Westerners recognized. They thought the Plains Indians were the smartest. Why was that? Because the Plains Indians had organized warfare, right? We recognize that. California Indians, we had warfare, but it was very subtle. We poisoned you and you dropped dead the next day. And of course, the Europeans had a hard time understanding subtlety. But let's think about the whole question here. There's a huge question that the ethnographers and others have asked. How did so many people live so close together for 10,000 years or more, basically with very little physical warfare? How did that work out? And they were in this rich environment which they took care of. So my tribe, the Federated Indians of Graton, Rancheria, we're descendants of Coast Miwok from Marin County and Southern Pomo from Sonoma County. We got put together, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But there was no such thing as Ohaloni, and there was no such thing as Miwok, and there was no such thing as Pomo. Those are language classifications that linguists classified groups of people by language. We were several, dozens upon dozens of independent small nations, 500 to 1,000 people, with often a very small area, Aboriginal area. I mean, we traded with one another, but we had our own laws, our own, and so on and so forth, and we were independent and worked things out with one another. And we never thought of ourselves. Usually, each of those nations and places was associated with a particular landscape. So, for instance, we usually called ourselves by the landscape. You've heard of the town Petaluma? Petaluma translates in Coast Miwok to slope ridge or sloping ridge. So that was an actual Aboriginal village where you had people from the village of Slope Ridge, because there was an actual slope there, a feature of the landscape. That is essentially how we knew who we were, by the landscape. The landscape was our text. The landscape was full of mnemonic pegs on which we hold stories, knew ourselves, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't answer the question, how did we all live together so peacefully and for so long? You can have good stories, bad stories, all kinds of different stories. Our political organization was such that there really wasn't there was a chief, but listen to this. The chief was selected by 4 or 5 elder wise women. You could nominate your son, your husband, your brother, an uncle, but it was the women who picked him and then trained him in the art of leadership and elocution for 7 to 8 years. I think some of our leaders today could use a little wise women advice. But he was more or less the sort of the handmaiden for the dreamers and the people in the different cults. So, the person would say, well, this is when the salmon are running, chief, go out and tell the people to get the nets ready. And it worked that way. Essentially, we were organized around a lot of secret cults. And you often didn't know who belonged to what cult. And that was predicated on a fundamental belief, everybody, that everything in nature had power. Everything, a rock, the smallest animal, everything had power, and you didn't know what that was. People the same way. I would have songs, and you might not know all my songs, but if you were to steal something from me or hurt me or do something to my family, even if I deliberately didn't want retribution, my songs and my protection would cause an aunt or an uncle to drop dead the next day. So we were constantly reminded of what we didn't know. And you were descended as a knower. You were constantly reminded that you were only a part of the world around you and you couldn't control everything around you. And if you attempted to do that, it would come back on you. Now, the ethnographers said we were a culture predicated on fear and black magic. It was a culture instead predicated on profound respect, where you didn't know. And that's how we were able to live virtually with little physical warfare. Think about it. If I were to go hit the person in the front row physically, all of you would see me strike the person, right? And you would know, hey, he's got no songs. He's got no spiritual power. We can go hit him without what? Any retribution. Physical warfare was considered the lowest form of warfare. If you had to resort to that, you really were a sort of powerless person. So there was really no hierarchy. Everything had power. You didn't know what was what and who was who. You respected. Difference was honored. We were cultures predicated on honoring heterogeneity rather than homogeneity. So the more different you were, obviously, the more in awe we were of you and honored you. And if you heard voices, instead of giving you pills to stop the voices, we cultivated those voices. I think a pretty healthy situation. Now, we weren't perfect, and I don't want to romanticize the situation. We were human. We got angry. We did things. I used to hear the old people always talk about who poisoned who and all this kind of stuff. But basically, it was a culture that was worked for thousands and thousands of years here. And we didn't just run around, picking things off trees. It wasn't in Eden. We worked hard. We tended the landscape. So we pruned the trees back, the acorn trees. We did controlled burning, which was so important. Obviously, if we continued to do that, we might not have the fires. One of the things that then, of course, there was contact with Europeans. And folks, that was pretty radical, because think of the worldview picture that I just showed you. And you get in contact with a people who have a completely different philosophy, where there's a hierarchy of a God up here and a descending order, man, woman, all the way down. And that land is to be taken for ownership and all that sort of thing. Totally antithetical. We didn't understand them. They didn't understand us. Interestingly enough, the first two laws that the Spanish, the missionaries, imposed on us was a law against burning, because they thought we were burning the land so that their cattle and horses couldn't eat, and a law against bathing. They didn't like the nudity. So they put clothes on us. So, of course, the joke was, remember, in those days, folks didn't bathe. Remember? Perfume and all those things came about. And there's a joke today among Indian people that who's a brave? You know, a brave? It was a person that could go close enough to a European. Because they stunk so badly. So, of course, Then we were missionized, as were the Ohlone in this area. The San Francisco Mission took us in, and then San Rafael, which was created there. And there were a couple different waves of the missions, but eventually, before the missions were secularized, they were marching us into the missions because we were dying so fast, and they needed to keep replacing a workforce. Then, as you know, I'm jumping very quickly here, we went into the Mexican period. The missions were secularized here in 1834. The Mexicans continued what they had been doing, the Spaniards had been doing throughout Central America and the Caribbean. Remember, Catholics, slavery was forbidden, right? So, but they got around that. And what they did throughout the Caribbean and Central America is, in place of slavery, they created situations of indentured servitude. They created convict leasing, and the whole notion that you had to belong to someone and that sort of thing. The Mexicans did the same thing here. The Mexican rancheros, Vallejo and his men, did the same thing. You had to have belonged to somebody, or you got put in jail. If you got put in jail, they sold your labor. Of course, the Bear Flag Revolution came along, and California became a state. The first piece of legislation that the state of California passed was the Act for the Protection of and Government of Indians, which legalized Indian slavery. How? By using the exact same system that the Mexicans had used, and guess who helped draft the legislation? The man who was defeated by the Californians, by the Americans, General Vallejo. Little ironic how these things go. That law was not repealed until 1868, 3 years after the Civil War. We became then indentured servants. Convict leasing in California here and in North Bay was not prohibited, was not outlawed until 1937. So until 1937, my ancestors, my grandmother, my uncles, great uncles, were being, if they got put in jail, they were being sold on Sunday mornings in the town square, their labor. That was going on, and we were not citizens until 1924. As the people were decimated, the landscape was decimated. The landscape, which was our sacred text, our Bible, if you will, our Quran, if you will, was decimated so that we didn't recognize it. In sum, by the time we began to get shoved together on rancherias or reservations, survivors of us in the early part of the 20th century, we were greatly reduced in numbers. Today, jumping forward, in my tribe, which is comprised of survivors that were pushed onto one little rancheria, there were approximately 20,000 Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo at the time of contact. Today, we have 1,400 enrolled members in the tribe. All of us are the descendants of 14 survivors, all of whom were women, all of whom were concubines or wives of early Mexicans or Americans. All right, it's miraculous that the stories, the languages survived. I mean, it's miraculous. It shows you the power of my ancestors, my dad's people, who I'm so proud of. I mean, it's amazing. And as I always say to my people when I get frustrated, if we think we're tired and we have problems, they got us here. And so anyway, as a young kid, I used to hear a lot of the stories. I used to hear the creation stories, and they used to tell the stories in the old days and even recently at night, in the wintertime. We were told we could only tell stories in the wintertime. I think we're still safe. It's kind of rainy. But because in the summer you had to pay attention to where you were going. And so in the winter, we would sit long nights, and usually on a table or up like this, and the storyteller would not be lit. And the room would be dark, and the storyteller would imitate the voices of the characters in the stories so that the children and the young people could visualize. It was as good as reading, because the young people and others hearing had to do what? Imagine and picture and listen. So that's the way the stories were told, and we often told the stories in great cycles, creation cycles. So they would go on all winter, and people would change them up and move them around, and they would go around and around. And what the ethnographers collected were just bits and pieces for language, and they weren't really whole. So one of the things that concerns me, and we'll talk about towards the end of this, is I think it's so important, folks. Now, we're not the only one. We're not the only ones that are homeless in our homeland. All of us, to some extent, are homeless. How do we create a safe home for all of us? How do we become responsible for the landscape? I think one of the first things we have to do is find ways to restory the landscape. Create a place of mnemonic pegs. And now it's going to be Spanish stories, Mexican stories, Filipino stories, German stories, Italian stories. We're all part of the landscape. But what I thought for my people I would do is start recreating some of the creation tales that I was told. And actually it happened, Word for Word Theater commissioned me. They had done some short stories of mine, and Word for Word Theater commissioned a story. I think they did tell me it was supposed to be a children's story. I didn't read carefully enough, and I wrote some dramatic thing about an alcoholic teenage mother and all this drama, and of course they quickly told me that that wasn't quite what they wanted. And I hadn't written children's stories before, so I looked at some of the classics from the European tradition, Grimm's fairy tales and others. And so I thought, okay, I will fashion a cycle where each story stands alone. And I created 16 stories that sort of stand alone and yet have I hope, the ethic and aesthetic of place in them. I think our young people need new stories. I see some people that are as old as me here. We grew up with those stories where the hero was exalted, right? You had to be a hero. You had to be special. Or women, Cinderella. You had to suffer, and then the prince will come. You put up with awful things, and the prince will come. We know, no wonder we're all messed up. How many of us did that come true for, right? So those stories really didn't prepare us for reality or for life. So I thought, what can I do, particularly for my young people and for all people? And so I created these stories, and they come from the time, and we believe that the time before this one, all the animals were people. There was a time before this one when all the animals were people. And we believe that on top of Sonoma Mountain, Coyote created the world. All right? And what happened was, just to show you again how our way of thinking is quite antithetical from others, what happened was, one of those animals got really greedy and caused a lot of trouble, and they ousted that animal, and that was the human being. And the other human beings grew claws and wings and became bird and eagles and flew away from that bad person, and us humans are left here to try to reconnect. That's our job, right? Because we were dumb. Where we thought we were really smart, being clever. So I'm going to go, what I did is I went back to that time when animals were still people, and I created this cycle of stories of how a mountain was made. And if you'd allow me, I will read a short one, a little introduction, and I'll read a short one. I'm really happy these have taken off. Word for Word Theater has performed them in over 90 schools in the Bay Area. And I love that our young people are now learning to perform them, and that they're going on. I will read a little bit just to give you some context and a story, and then I'll answer questions, and I think you'll get a sense of what's going on here. So from the beginning of the book, just to give you some context, I'll talk to you about the book here. This is a story of Sonoma Mountain. It isn't one story. It is many stories that make up the one story. The stories go on because the mountain itself has so many things: rocks and animals, birds and grasses, fish, frogs, springs and creek trees, and each thing has a story. Many of the stories connect with other stories. This makes sense because the animals and plants and all other things on Sonoma Mountain connect with one another. The mountain has always been a special place for Coast Miwok people. The stories from the mountain teach important lessons, and many of the songs that Coast Miwok people have sung since the beginning of time are gifts from the mountain and come from the stories. It is said that Coyote was sitting atop Sonoma Mountain when he decided to create the world and people, but that is part of the big story in mountain, and we are getting really ahead of ourselves right now. The best way to hear the story is to listen to Coyote's twin granddaughters, Answer Woman and Question Woman. Some people say they are a pair of crows that sit on a fence rail partway up the mountain. near the place folks call Gravity Hill. Other people swear Answer Woman and Question Woman are humans. These people claim to have seen the twins, two identical-looking women with long, dark hair, leaning against the same fence rail, talking. In any event, Answer Woman and Question Woman have been on Sonoma Mountain a long time. They are the daughters of Coyote, after all. They know all the stories, but this is their predicament. Answer Woman knows all the answers, but she cannot think of them unless she is asked. Question Woman, on the other hand, cannot remember a single answer, not one story, and she must always ask her questions in order to hear the answer again. So these sisters are talking in between, and they've told a few stories at this point, and leading up to this story, they're sitting there talking, and I say they keep talking, and one sister says, "Remember when I said, if we only see a poppy as a flower, if we don't know its story, then we can't learn any lessons from it." Question Woman said, "I don't remember." "Don't you remember I said if grass is just grass or a rabbit just a rabbit, then what do we know?" And I answered myself, "I told you, we know very little then. Dear sister, have you forgotten that I am Question Woman? Have you forgotten that I cannot remember a single story, which is why I must always ask you questions in order to hear the answer again?" "Ah, yes, I guess I forgot," answered Answer Woman. "But in any event, there is something else I must tell you about the animals and plants and their stories." "And that is?" asked Question Woman. "In addition to knowing each animal's story, we must see that in its story there will always be the stories of other animals too. In that way, we are reminded of how all of life on the mountain is connected. That in fact, all of the stories together make up the one big ongoing story of the mountain, the lesson we must never forget." "I think I understand," said Question Woman, "at least for the moment. For example, in the story about Waterbug, you can see other creatures' stories. Eagle is in Waterbug's story. Waterbug's story becomes part of her story too. Yes, even a creature seemingly as simple as Waterbug is connected to great creatures like Eagle and important to them." "What is the story of Waterbug? What's his story?" "It's the story of how Waterbug stole water." "Water is a creature too? A spirit like the others?" "Oh yes," answered Answer Woman. "Water is a most important spirit. Listen to the story. Waterbug walks away with Copeland Creek." This happened at the big village near the headwaters of Copeland Creek. Waterbug lived there with his many grandchildren, and years before, his old wife had left him. He was a stout little old man with skinny short legs. Though he worked hard and helped his many grandchildren, he was often irritable, and people usually tried to avoid him. It wasn't just because he is old that he was irritable. He had been a rather unpleasant character most of his life. Some people said he went around mad because he was born short and had skinny legs. Other people said it was just his nature to be hot-headed. One morning, after he complained unmercifully about the pinole his old wife had served him for breakfast, she stood by the creek and said aloud to the open sky, "How long do I have to put up with him?" And in that moment, she rose into the sky and became an eagle, the greatest of soaring birds. Many miracles happened there at the water's edge. Once a plain-looking lizard found himself with a blue tail, and that is how blue-tailed Skink was born. And it was at the creek's edge that Spider taught the people to weave beautiful baskets after a girl had gone to the creek to fetch water for her sick grandmother. "I have no way to pack water back to my sick grandmother, but with my cup hands," the girl said. Spider stepped forth from the willows and said, "Don't worry, don't cry, young girl. I will teach you to weave a basket so tight you will be able to pack water with it to your grandmother." So the creek was sacred to the villagers. Its water taught people many lessons about life, reminded people of many important stories, not least that every living creature needed water and thus was united by the creek. Everyone needed water. Each morning, people cleansed themselves in the creek, starting the day with the water's blessings. They offered scraps of food to the water as well as songs and prayers in gratitude. They didn't want the beautiful flowing creek to forget them. One late fall day before the rains, when the hills were very dry, Waterbug spied a woman bend down and drink from the creek with her lips. It was Deer, and she was an attractive woman. Waterbug was resting under a good-sized bay laurel tree there. As he sat, he noticed that many people came and drank water, bending down and taking the water with their mouths. Of course, this was not unusual, for he too often drank water from the creek in this fashion. But he had never paid such close attention before. He had never sat so long watching others. He was amazed at how each person came and bent down and kissed the water. If only I could be water, then everyone would kiss me, a crabby, stout man with skinny legs, he thought. The idea was crazy, and it made no sense, and Waterbug knew it. But when he saw Quail, the most beautiful woman of all, stoop and kiss the water, he lost his mind, for he could not stop thinking about her lovely, soft lips on the water. He stood up then and went to the creek's edge and spoke thus, "Oh, I do not want to know all of your secrets, but only your song that enchants all to kiss you. I am an irritable old man with no wife, and I am short and stout with skinny legs. Certainly no one will kiss me without your song." The creek did not answer him. Again he said, "Oh, I do not want to know all of your secrets, but only your song that enchants all to kiss you. I am an irritable old man with no wife, and I am short and stout with skinny legs. If I could just borrow your song for a while, I would be able to get someone to kiss me." Still, the creek did not answer him. "All right, have it your way, you old thing with moss on your edges," Waterbug said with utmost bitterness. He walked off, but as you might imagine, he was not satisfied. He kept thinking about Quail's lips, and he was determined to get the creek's song. "I know what I'll do," he said to himself. "I'll kidnap the creek and force him to give me his song. I'll hide him in a secret cave and starve him until he gives me his song," which is just what Waterbug did. But not until he had made careful plans. He had to make sure that no one saw him kidnap the creek, and that he had plenty of time to get to the far side of the mountain with his prisoner. Since night was the best time to carry out his deed, Waterbug figured he would only have to worry about the folks who traveled about after dark, such as raccoon, bobcat, and owl. An expert fire maker, Waterbug called these night creatures together and offered to teach them how to make an enormous bonfire. Thus, while teaching these night fellows, Waterbug made an enormous fire around which they immediately began relaxing and telling one another stories. Then Waterbug hurried off to the creek. He built a dam and then pushed the dam closer and closer to the creek's headwaters until he was able to fit all of the creek's water in a carrying basket. Thus the water was in his basket. He trudged up to the secret cave on the far side of the mountain. "Now will you give me your song that enchants all to kiss you?" he asked the water trapped in his basket. Water said nothing. "All right, have it your way," Waterbug said angrily. "No one will find you here, and you will starve and die." In the morning, the villagers were alarmed to find that the creek was gone. All that was left was a trail of sand and dry rocks. "What has happened?" the villagers cried. "Have we offended our beloved creek in some way?" Days and nights went by, and still the water did not return. The villagers stood on the dry sand and prayed. They offered good pinoli and fine baskets and necklaces, and still there was no water. "What are we going to do?" they wondered aloud. "We will die of thirst, each and every one of us, and the mountain will turn to stone." Meanwhile, Waterbug hiked to the secret cave each night and asked Waterbug for a song. Water trapped inside Waterbug's basket was growing smaller. Soon there would be nothing left of him. He would starve and die, just as Waterbug had said. He figured he had to give Waterbug his song, for if he did not, he would surely die, and then there would be no chance of him ever making it back to the village again. "All right," he said at last, "I will teach you my song." And he sang thus: "Bending to me, you see your love. Bending to me, you see your wide open eyes. Everywhere I go, like that, hey, 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 hey." Then off went Waterbug with the song. However, nothing in the village changed. But then why would it? Waterbug had left Water trapped in the secret cave and forgot about him there. Soon it was winter, and still there was no water in the creek. It rained, but the creek remained a trail of sand and dry rocks, unable to collect the water that fell from the sky. The salmon hovered at creek's dry mouth near Laguna de Santa Rosa, unable to make their way up the creek. "I am starving," said Bear. "I have no salmon to eat." "I am starving," said Blue Jay. "I have no nuts to eat. The acorn trees are drying up." "I am starving," said Sparrow. "I have no seeds. The grasses are all dried up." "We are all starving," the villagers cried. "We are starving and we are dying of thirst." They continued to pray and sing songs and make offerings to the creek, but to no avail. Each night, Raccoon, Bobcat, and Owl made a big bonfire the way Waterbug had taught them. And everyone in the village gathered around the fire to discuss what they might do to bring Copeland Creek back. At one point, Raccoon remembered that the night before the creek disappeared, Waterbug had offered to teach him and Bobcat and Owl how to build a fire, huge bonfire. "We have been tricked," Raccoon said. "Yes," Bobcat said. "Waterbug kept us busy so that we would not see what he was doing." "Certainly Waterbug walked away with Copeland Creek," Owl said. Waterbug, sitting with the others by the fire, denied any wrongdoing. "Why would I want to kidnap the creek?" he asked. At that point, Quail stood up. "I'll tell you why you wanted to kidnap the creek," she said, "so you could kiss me each morning, you terrible old man." Quail was furious, for each morning she had been enchanted by Waterbug. Now Waterbug knew his secret was out. "All right," he said, "I will bring water back to the creek." When Waterbug got to the secret cave, he looked inside the basket and found there was only a single drop of water left. Hurrying with the basket, he ran to the creek, but alas! When he emptied the single drop of water into the dry creek bed, nothing happened. The single drop of water rested in the tiny crevice of a rock. "The creek is so offended it won't flow," cried Quail. But it was Eagle, Waterbug's former wife, who swooped down and said, "Remember, each spirit on this earth has a special song that gives it life and power. I bet that miserable old Waterbug, my stout, skinny-legged ex-husband, has Creek song." "I do not have Creek song," Waterbug said, but Eagle would not believe him. She clutched him in her sharp talons and lifted him straight into the sky, so high that Waterbug not only saw his village far below, but also the great length of Copeland Creek, where the trees and grasses had turned yellow and brown, and where villagers up and down the creek bed were starving and dying of thirst. "Spit out the song," demanded Eagle. "Spit it out." Waterbug still denied he had water's song. He was still thinking of Quail's lips touching his. "I have no patience with you," Eagle said, at which point she let go of Waterbug with one of her talons, causing him to gasp, expelling water's song, which fell to earth as a single drop of water. That drop of water fell into the tiny crevice where Waterbug left water after he dropped him out of the basket, and that way the two drops of water, one being water, the other being water's song, began to grow, and Copeland Creek flowed once more. Meanwhile, Waterbug was still dangling from a single talon. Before Eagle was all the way back to earth, Waterbug fell, causing both of his skinny legs to bend so that his feet were pointing backwards. The people of the village took no pity on him. Coyote, the chief, came forward saying, "I think the proper punishment for Waterbug would be to feed him to the hungry salmon making their way back to our village now." And it was then that the creek spoke to Coyote and all the village people. "No, if you do that, if you kill Waterbug, you will forget what happened here in this place. Better to forgive him and give him a job cleaning the water and guarding the creek on late fall days when the water is low and someone might attempt to steal it away again." The people of the village agreed and thanked the creek for the good advice. Waterbug went to the water then, and that is why, in late summer and early fall, you find him keeping watch over the creek, gliding over the water's smooth surface, gliding backwards because his feet are still pointing in the opposite direction. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'll take questions or answers for that matter. And I can't see too well. Let me put on my glasses. It's hard with this light there. Yes, sir.
I have a big question for a moment. It occurred to me as you were reading that beautiful and charming story that it's almost an allegory of the story that you told us of the almost death and rebirth of the coastal Miwok southern Pomos down to one drop.
Testing.
The 14 survivors
I don't know if everyone could hear that. Shall we?
That was a wonderful question or comment. I think I can kind of repeat it, sir, if and if I...
By the way, you know me, I'm Daniel Boyar.
Oh, Daniel! Oh, my goodness, Daniel! I knew this guy I'll say this, when I was young. Is that fair, Daniel?
It is.
Okay. When I see Daniel, too, I always love to come out. Everybody, I belong to two tribes. My mother was Jewish. So people always say, Jewish and Indian? And I said, yeah, it makes me a smart savage. I get the savagery from the Jews and the smarts from the Indians. Of course, I remember Daniel, a Jewish man, after I had this talk, came up to me and said to me, I don't think that's very funny. In fact, I think it was very anti-Semitic. And I said, sir, it was a joke, and you're not very smart. No, it wasn't Daniel. What Daniel said, commented on or observed, is that just as the people, there was this horrendous genocide here and destruction, and few people left, it was almost, the story of the water almost becomes analogous in the sense that there's just a couple drops of water left through which the creek was revived. Daniel, I guess the best way to answer that is, yes, I didn't think of that, but I think that pervades my thinking about everything in the world today, that regardless of the situation that we're in, that this tribe and all of us, and with all the things that are going on in the destruction of the landscape, let that not daunt us or stop that. Let us rejoice that that life is still here, and it's our duty to revive it and perpetuate it. Okay? Yes, sir.
Did I understand correctly that you said the storyteller was sitting in darkness?
Yes.
So it was kind of like live radio. It was his voice and their imaginations, of course.
Yeah, much like live radio with the lights off. Yeah, I would say with the lights off. Because
Meaning it's live right in your presence, not a thing.
right, but it does, the whole idea was that you didn't see the storyteller and you had to picture everything. And live radio, in the best sense...
Listening radio might have been better.
Yes, works that way, yeah. I grew up listening a lot, and I think that's how, I think young people, we really need to listen. And because, remember, the story that I told, I'm only half of it, you're the other half. So, I think that's really, really important. Other answers or questions? Yes?
I was going to ask you, how you feel about, your song, what it, is your writing kind of like your song?
People always said, Mabel McKay, who I wrote about, our last doctor, dreamer and doctor, people used to ask her, oh, when you die, what's going to happen? Where's the spirit going to go? And she thought that was the funniest damn thing. She laughed and she said, the spirit, it ain't going to go anywhere. It ain't going to hide under a rock. And just some of us may not be doctors. We might not be the old, rabbis of prophecy. We may not be those people. But all of us has a gift and a spirit. And we have to doctor with whatever we have, even if that's giving the person that parked your car a big tip. Yeah, even if that means all of us have the opportunity in our lives to doctor and to heal and do whatever we do. And I said, even if it's kindness, even if it's giving a person a big tip, doing whatever, we have that opportunity in whatever we do. And the choice is, do you doctor or do you destroy? And so I remember Mabel saying to me when I was a young man, about 19 years old, and I never read a book till I was in junior in high school. So I was troubled youth, and she said to me, with all that's happened to you, and let's just, Daniel, if we can be analogous here with lots of other things, with all that's happened to you, and she was a medicine woman, so she had to learn and see in her dreams all the poisons and dangers of the earth, because she had to learn how to deal with them. and I'm making an analogy here that she didn't, I'm assuming, or I read from her, but she said to me, with all that's happened to you, you have two choices. She says you can become angry and hateful and let holes open in your heart where you poison yourself and then in turn poison and hate other people. She said, or you can take everything that's happened to you and use that to doctor. And she says, you already got hate, that's easy. Try the other. Right? She wants that. I just wrote recently for the League of the Redwoods, their centenary 100-year thing. I wrote about love medicine, and as a young man, I remember somebody wanted to give me love medicine. They said you could get anybody you want. And to make a long story short, I was smart enough to ask the advice of Mabel, and she pointed out that once you have that, you can't die unless you pass it on, and anybody that you use that on, you can't get rid of them. But what she said to me was, you're good looking enough, try the regular way. So you choices, and the spirit is good. But there's so much, today with all that's going on, what really scares me the most for all of us people who, and I always tell my students every day, it's not a sin to think. What frightens me the most for us, especially some of us older folks, is that we get disappointed and the gloominess of the world and the situation robs us of the opportunity of the beauty in every moment that we still can have. And I think living that is medicine enough, right? Yes?
You started off mentioning a point that I'm familiar with, Gravity Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a teenager, we used to go there off of Leashow or Roberts Road, and you could
That's the exact place.
Yeah, and then put your car in neutral and then coast up the hill there. And so
While the car is pointing down, yes.
yeah. And so I was wondering, I guess in the maybe in the Euro popular version of things that the wheel wasn't around then, maybe when the reference came up for the indigenous people for Gravity Hill. So I was just wondering if you had a story about Gravity Hill, or
That's where I threw that in there, because I don't know that we ever called it Gravity Hill. But what's interesting, the question is about Gravity Hill, the actual place. And there is a place, and by the way, the young people are still parking there. They have another term for it. They call it Pecker Point. But and it's a real nuisance when you're trying to drive home and back and forth because they're parked out there, and you try to be polite and it's late at night and you have to get to the book festival the next day, and you think,
is that why you were late?
yes, the anger and the poison starts erupting, and you think, try to be nice. But I created that. That was a creation on my part. Sonoma Mountain, and this is speculation again about why it intrigued the indigenous folks for miles around, I think is because the mountain is always moving. It has all these things. From a distance, it looks like a bunch of slow rising hills. It's not dramatic like Mount Tamalpais. It's not dramatic in those ways, but you get up there and you get lost in it. It turns and it twists, and there's water pockets here, there's water everywhere. And if you build a stone fence, it's always going to fall apart because the land is always shifting up there. So I think it was always considered a place of movement, change, opportunity. The land's still alive. It's breathing. So I think that was, I think what intrigued me about the place. But yeah, the place is there. Yes, sir.
So Waterbug teaches nocturnal creatures to make fire. And you referred to the tradition of cultural fire. And I wonder if you talk about that. You know that the Klamath River tribes had brought back cultural fire.
Yes, if I talk about cultural fire, fire was essential. And we were always burning and cultivating. First of all, what most importantly for right now, and I know the Klamath, we also are working with the local parks in our area to do controlled burning, to work with them to reconstitute the practice. So what we always were doing were burning, because the burning did a couple things. Most importantly, as I was beginning to say, it cleared out the underbrush, understudy, which is so lethal for fires, right? And so in the old days, the landscape had these big groves of older oak trees and then redwoods on the coast, but you had almost like a savanna where you had these big trees. You didn't have all this brush all over the hills that you have now, because that was constantly burned away. And the burning then also killed the worms and the bugs that went up and ate the acorns. Okay, so that gave us more food, plus other animals. Furthermore, if you go up to Sonoma County now, it has never been this green and lush, because that burning, it fertilizes the land. The cleared land, the more grass, the more elk and pronghorn we used to have in deer. There were huge herds of thousands of elk and pronghorn that roamed those hills. Again, almost like the savanna. I mean, it was amazing. It was, amazing. Quail, birds would fly up in the sky, especially the Bay Area with all the water. Birds would fly up where the sky was dark for 2 hours at a time, like night. It was so thick with animals. But that was partly because of the way we co-evolved and took care of things so that there would be more of them, which would enable more of them for each other and for us, and keep the landscape going. We also, and because we had very relatively small circumscribed areas, we took care of those areas. And the villages were, now I'm jumping from fire to water, but the villages were organized around water. So if you were up on a hill and your village was on a creek, you were responsible for keeping that creek clear so that the water that made it to the lagoon would be clean and good. And that way the people all around the lagoon would allow you to go down there and pick potatoes and do whatever, water potatoes, and do that sort of thing. Now, if the lagoon people didn't take care of the water and so things couldn't grow, you could put poison in the creek and get rid of them. So the health of the water was always indicative of political health. Yes. I hope I went from fire to water, but
I wondered if I'm sure you know about what's happening on what's now called the border of Mendocino County and Sonoma County, with that group of redwood trees that have been bought up and that they want to log, that the company wants to log. I know there's a movement in order to stop that in court. I wonder, are you involved in that at all?
Those are the northern tribes, and we've certainly supported that in written letters. And I would do whatever I needed to do. We know the tribal people up there, and we've written letters in support of that effort. And it's pretty tragic. There's very little virgin, so-called virgin forest. We call it ancient. The redwood trees were really old. You know how long those redwood trees, 40,000 years or more, they've been here as we know them today? So that means there was water going. And our stories go that when the water rose during the last Pliocene and we left the coastal areas and had to go up and live in the caves in Mount St. Helena in that area, we were able to know when to go back as we watched as the water lowered, the trees were coming back. Those redwoods lived through it. And of course, people say, oh, that's a myth. Robert Oswalt, the great linguist from UC Berkeley, recorded our language in the Kashaya language in the late 50s. And he classified things by myth and all of that. And we told the story about the whale in the creek in Gualala River, that when the waters rose up, there was a whale there, and then we went up and moved up into the mountains east. He classified that as a myth. Ironically, somewhat ironically, about 4 or 5 years later, a group of geologists were in the area, and guess what they found? Whale fossils that dated from the same area. And as I tell my students, if that's a myth, then find me a piece of Noah's Ark. So the trees are, and again, when in the old times, when the trees and everybody and everything was a people, the trees and plants were people too, just as you saw in the waters a person. The redwoods were the ancient old wise ones. You lose the redwoods, you lose your ability to pass on stories. what did Gramsci say? History's a great teacher, there's just no students. Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about Coyote and how he's perceived or she's perceived?
Coyote, yes, and that's a really important question. Coyote's the creator, and in the Western world, the creator is this all-perfect being, right? Imagine your creator being a trickster who you couldn't trust. That makes you think. You have to think, right? And the danger of thinking too much is becoming coyote-like, thinking you're smart, right? So you have this trickster figure who created the world, half of it by mistake and by being greedy and stupid. So you're having to constantly negotiate. And that really kind of puts you in a position where you're simultaneously smart and creator-like, but you're always walking the tightrope of being a fool and causing trouble. It makes you think. Versus a set text where this happened, that happens, linear, you find your way how you fit in. So it's a very different kind of world. And you know, the ethnographers, when they came, we weren't concerned, like when the story, we'll tell a story about Coyote when he was married to Frog Woman, and she went down to the creek and would leach her acorns, and Coyote was always wanting to be with her, and he threw one son, he got jealous because she was too busy being a good mother and a good woman, and he wanted more time to mess around. So he said, I got an idea. I'll take both of our sons and throw one up into the sky and he'll become the sun, and I'll throw the other one up into the sky and he'll become the moon. Well, Frog Woman came back and she said, well, where are the kids? And he said, you know, I'm sick of you always worrying about them. You have no time for me. She said, well, what do you mean? Where are the kids? And he goes, I threw one up into the sky and he became the sun, and I threw the other one up into the sky and he became the moon. And of course, she began to cry and cry and cry, and her tears created streams and lakes. The ethnographers had a fit with it. These Indians are so stupid, they can't even remember that just a minute ago there was water there. We didn't care about linear order or chronology. It was consequences of behavior which was the focus. Totally different situation, which also explains why to this day, this is your ideological tag for you anthropologists and folklorists. The ideological tag is, that's why today when you see Frog, she's sitting like this, because she's always looking up in the day at her sons. How are we doing? Good. Oh, okay. I have no idea what time it is. Oh, wow. Okay. I'll give you all the answers.
I've heard from Pomo and Miwok people this idea of poisoning, and I always wondered: are we talking about real, like a physical poison, or a spiritual poison?
I love that question. Is it real, or is it poison? I remember, it makes me think of what Mabel McKay used to say: "There's no such thing as imagination." Think about that. If I can, the best way I might be able to answer that is to say they're all of the above. So we had physical ways. For example, I'll just tell you some things, don't use it, but ground poppy seeds, golden poppies, you ground that stuff up and you put enough in, and I hear some people like to take that, it helps you go to sleep. Well, we gave you enough so that you went to sleep forever, if you were that kind of person, right? Then there are certain songs and things. Again, as a young man, I remembered a couple people wanting to give me things to help kill people. And they said, you sing this song and this will do that. But they were old and they knew they couldn't die till they passed that on. So sometimes it was a song, sometimes it was a physical thing, sometimes there's different kinds of things, different ways that they could do that. Then there's love medicine. And that's a form of poison. And you have to mix together redwood pitch is part of the mixture. And quail droppings. Why, folks? Because quail was the most beautiful woman. So there's these songs, and one of them is, I won't tell you it in Indian, but the line is, and you repeat it several times and with your little concoction, Your name is on my lips. Your name is on my lips. Yes, I had an aunt who, Lynn, and she lost her love of her life, a young husband. He ran off with a woman. He told her, you're not so pretty anymore. I want a younger woman. And she was heartbroken, and she went to an old aunt, and the old aunt said, I'll give you something. I'll give you a song. And she started singing that song, she told me. And she said that guy all of a sudden was at her back porch in the middle of the night. Please take me back. Please, I'm in love with you. Take me back. And he followed her everywhere. And she said it really started to get obnoxious. And she was in the old Santa Rosa movie theater downtown. And she was sitting with a couple of her girlfriends watching the movie. And all of a sudden, this guy leans behind her and he says, please, please take me back. She said to me, she says, Greg, I was so damn mad. She said, I stood up, pulled up my dress and pulled down my pants and said, kiss my ass. But again, are these things true or not? Let me just quickly tell you, as Mabel always used to say, whether you believe it or not, it's true. That was her other great disclaimer. Let me illustrate again another sense of reality, a story. And I think, Daniel, you know this story because it was around the time I was at Stanford doing graduate work. And a friend of mine in the English department was doing a more traditional dissertation. I was trying to get the story of Mabel McKay, and that became very difficult. But a friend of mine, a woman there, was doing a more, shall we say, typical dissertation on the Renaissance, something on the Renaissance. And I was telling her about this medicine woman. Why don't you drive? You can drive up to the res with me to meet her and all that. And she was so excited to go, so excited So we get up to the res, and there's Mabel, and as we remember Mabel, perfectly dyed, coiffed hair, her dress, her nylons, patent leather shoes, and of all things, she had a nice little lunch for us of chicken soup and tuna fish sandwiches. And my friend was so disappointed. I could see disappointment on her face. I'm sure she was expecting something in buckskins hovering around, with a grinding herbs or something. So we were sitting there eating, and the person was kind of, my friend, she kind of was listening, and all of a sudden Mabel says, I knew a woman who loved a snake. And my friend perked up. We're going to get to the Indian stuff. We're getting close. We're getting to the Indian stuff. So Mabel said, yeah, it was a friend of mine, and she lived up in Lake County. And she was married, and her husband used to take care of the cattle at night, because when the cattle were calving in the hills, they hired the owner, the rancher, who would hire a watchman for the coyotes or mountain lions that would come. And so this guy, this friend of hers, her husband would go out at night, and she would fix him dinner, and he'd leave at night. And she said she had fixed him dinner one night, she told Mabel, and there was a knock on the door. And the woman told Mabel, something told me I shouldn't answer it. But she said I did. And I opened the door, and there was a really good-looking guy standing there in a black hat and black clothes. And as Mabel started chuckling, as she told us, she said, well, she let him in, and one thing led to another. Well, in the morning, the husband came back, and there was a vase on the table like this here, and he saw a black snake, a little black snake curled up in that. And he said, well, this is strange, and he went and threw it out. Well, 4 more mornings, he came back, and that snake was there. On the 5th morning, he said, something's dangerous. Something's really wrong here. I'm going to take this snake out and chop it up and kill it. At which point the woman, figuring this had something to do with what was going on in the night, and she immediately confessed her transgressions to her husband. At which point he said, now I'm really going to chop it up. So he took it out and just cut that thing, took an axe, smashed it, everything. But then Mabel said, but, it kept coming back. He kept coming back. And my friend's having a panic attack at this point. And she said, Mabel, what does the snake symbolize? And Mabel goes, I don't know nothing from no symbols. And she goes, was it a snake or was it a man? And Mabel didn't answer. So she started talking about something else. And then she came back around, as storytellers often do. And she says, about a couple months after that, it was summertime, and she said, I went to the store in Middletown, and it was a really hot evening, and I just had pulled up my car, and I was just about to get out, and I saw this man come out, all dressed in black, and he was carrying a paper bag of groceries, and instead of going up the highway, walking up the highway, he went down into the dry creek and started walking up the creek. And Mabel said, I think that was the guy. And then she started laughing, and Mabel said, and he was good looking. My friend's having an attack. Mabel, I mean, what? Was it a man or was it a snake? I just want to know, what was it? And then Mabel thought for a while, and she said, I don't know, but it was a problem. You never know what spirit, huh? So, yes. Okay. Yes. Ma'am.
Did you do your dissertation on Mabel McKay?
The dissertation, as Daniel knows, became a book about how I couldn't write the book about Mabel, her life story, because she kept going around and around, and we were trained, again, when you do autobiography and so forth, that you tell a linear story, and so all of that. And Mabel constantly was perplexing. You couldn't lock her up. And the book that I wrote about Mabel eventually, that UC pressed, became the story about how I couldn't lasso Mabel, but it was about what she did best, about how she doctored and healed as she healed me in the process.
What's the name of the book?
Mabel McKay, Weaving the Dream. Yeah. She was an amazing woman, never compromised. She worked in an apple cannery 20 years, all the while the Smithsonian was collecting her baskets. She said she needed the pension. She couldn't be sold. Her baskets, you could order a basket from her, but she would just have you put your name in a book, and at night, before she went to sleep, she'd run her finger over the names, and if the dream didn't come up for the basket, you didn't get your basket. So she kept peeling apples and doctoring the sick, and pretty remarkable how she did it. So other thoughts, questions? I can't. I'm sorry.
Hey, Greg.
Oh, Malcolm Margolin. Yay, how are you, Malcolm?
Good to see you.
You've heard some of these stories. Malcolm knows some of my people. He knows.
Yes.
They're all true, aren't they, Malcolm?
Everything's true. I came late. Did you talk about Mabel's funeral?
I did not talk about Mabel's funeral, and you were there, and so was Lynn here. And this is, again, whether you believe it or not, I have people who were there. So, in this room. So, Mabel always prophesied, as true doctors always did. S.E. Parrish, the same thing. They always told you, it seems pretty ubiquitous among Indian medicine people, but Mabel said that when she died, or when she was buried, that it would rain, and that when she was finally lowered, the sky would open. And, we all listen to these different things that they say, and half listen and don't listen or whatever. Anyway, Mabel died on May 31st. It was hot in summer. She was buried, I think, on June 2nd or 3rd, something, a couple days later. And it was hot. It was up there like 95 degrees, 100 degrees. And as we were carrying the coffin from the house to the cemetery, it began to cloud up. And by the time we got to the cemetery, it was pouring rain. I mean, buckets, so that the grave was actually filling with water. The grave was just filling with water. We couldn't. Mud was all over. Malcolm, you were there. You saw this. Lynn, you were there. It was, and so I was one of the pallbearers, and then I was one of the people to try to shovel the mud into the grave. It was but anyway, with a medicine person, you lower them 4 times. You raise them and lower them. And on the 4th time, when she was finally lowered, the sky right above us just opened wide with sun. And Malcolm, who is a rational man, Lynn, who's semi-rational, and me, way too rational, were there, and now I sit here and telling you this, Malcolm, and reminding me of this, thinking of Mabel saying, I can hear her voice saying, whether you believe it or not, it's true. Yes, Malcolm.
Yeah.
So what I remember about it was that she was buried up at Kashaya, which was not her reservation. And it was Essie Parish. She wanted to be buried next to Essie. And the whole thing was so awkward. The service was so awkward. It was as if nobody had ever died before. Nobody quite knew what to do. And the Christians had Christian prayers. There were Mormons that did Mormon things. There were some old-timers that keened. But then the most dramatic thing of all was that there was a silence, and then Frank Lapino was there. He had a boombox, and he turned on the boombox. It was Mabel singing her own funeral song. She was the last person that could sing herself to the other world.
Yeah.
And it was one of the most poignant and dramatic things I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I've never seen a ritual die with such grace.
Yeah, we all tried. You know, Malcolm, I kind of have I feel like that's darn Mabel again. We all think, different people think we know how we're going to send her off. She had it all figured out, played it, done. Right, her song, which she was going to go. Yeah, so. And she was buried up there, and it was a little awkward because, remember, Mrs. Parrish, the other doctor, took her in, and they doctored together. And Mabel was kind of protected Essie when people would try to go after Essie's kids or stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I remember going up there once when Essie was quite sick, and here's another story. You're getting a lot of stories today, folks. And I was 19 or 20 years old. I was home from college, from UCLA, and Mabel wanted me to drive her up to see Essie. Essie wasn't feeling well. Well, it was Christmas time, holidays. The last thing I wanted to do, and I'll just be honest, you know, we're all who we are. The last thing I wanted to do is drive an old lady all the way up Highway 1 to see another old lady on a Friday night. But Mabel talked me into it, and we went up there and we got to Jenner. And any of you know the Highway 1, how horrible that fog can be. And the fog was there, and I said to Mabel, let's turn around, this is awful. And she was just sitting there telling stories that she always did. And I said, Mabel, this is really a dumb idea. We should go back. And she said, well, I knew this old lady that knew a fog song. And I thought to myself, well, old lady, why don't you sing it? And she goes, yeah, I think it went something like this. And she started singing it. And I swear to you, for 20 miles up Highway 1, there was a tunnel. We went right through, and we got to the reservation. She got out of the car, and she says, I guess the song still works, don't it?
Does anybody else have a question? We have about 5 minutes left.
Yes, ma'am.
What courses do you teach and where?
I teach at Sonoma State University, and right now I'm teaching a large course with 200 undergraduates called Local California Indian History and Culture. I teach mostly literature courses and creative writing courses, but I teach that course. And it's interesting because, you know, I asked the students, how many of you know there's still Indians around here? And out of 200 students, I'm lucky if 30 will raise their hands. But then I asked them, how many of you know about the Graton Resort and Casino? Which, as a crow flies, is like 3 miles from the campus. They all raised their hands. Nobody's made a connection. Of course, I like to say nobody knew there were California Indians until there were casinos.
Do you know Denny Leonard?
Yes, I know Denny Leonard.
He's my neighbor.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go great. Yeah, so I keep teaching. It's important. If you have that gift, you need to keep doing it. So, yeah, and I keep trying to write. I'm doing a couple more panels today. I'm doing one immediately after lunch, about the California Indian genocide, the guys who wrote about it, and I'm interviewing them. I'm really excited about the one after that. Our young people are written essays about their lives, middle school and high school students, Indian students. I'm so proud of this. As I said, these young people are naming the monsters and making visible the invisible that has destroyed us for so long. They're our hope. Until recently, 80% of California Indian children dropped out by 9th grade. With the monies we've gotten, mostly from our casino, we've turned that around for all Indians, not just in our tribe, but all Indians in Marin and Sonoma counties, that we now have an 80% graduation rate, and that's just in a period of 7 to 8 years. Of course, you know, everybody always says to me, oh, gambling, casinos, that's not Indian. And I said, well, since when is Walmart or Mormon or Safeway Mormon?
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
So what books have you written? What books are available?
I've written a novel, a big novel called Watermelon Nights, and that's around. And Grand Avenue. Grand Avenue is a collection of stories which kind of launched me as a writer. And we adapted it into a 3-hour miniseries on HBO, and I wrote the script, and Robert Redford executive produced it. And that was about 20 years ago. Yeah, it's been a long time. And let's see, what else? Mabel McKay, Weaving the Dream, and a collection of essays about pedagogy and teaching and how we think about all these crazy things called Keeping Slug Woman Alive. And now, How Mountain Was Made, and I have a couple other stories coming out, books coming out. I'm back at it. I've been kind of busy. My tribe was illegally terminated, and I fought for years and wrote a bill that I finally got through Congress, restoring our rights. And then everybody started to discuss the C word, and it wasn't cancer. And the last thing that a nerd who had never been in a casino, I'd never been in a casino, ended up building a $1 billion casino that today is the 4th or 5th most successful casino in the world after 4 years. But what are we doing? We've given more money to Sonoma County and Rohnert Park for environmental restoration and social justice than anybody. We just bought Joan Baez's paintings of mischief makers and donated them to the Social Justice Center at Sonoma State University, where they will be archived in perpetuity. We are financing the measures to save the parks up there. I'm glad I lived long enough to see that we have bingo for the landscape and bingo for social justice.
Thank you, Greg Sarris. And your book?
Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.